Good evening. Thank you for joining us on a Friday evening. It's a pleasure to welcome Professor Rahul Sagar, which is at New York University, Abu Dhabi. He's Global Professor of Political Science, where he teaches political theory and intellectual history. His research focuses on executive power. His first book, Secrets and Leaks, The Dilemma of State Secrecy, received multiple awards. Today, we are going to discuss his another book, which is an anthology collection of lectures by Sir Madhava Rao to Sayaji Gaikwad III. These lectures were delivered in 1881, and they provide, in some ways, the first sort of treatise on modern statecraft, on statecraft in modern India. So to Rahul for coming here and joining us. We also have Suyash Rai. He's Deputy Director at Carnegie India. Suyash researches on political economy. Go to so whether it's politics or political economy or question philosophy and ethics. If I have something to ask, I have answers on most of these things. So I thought we could have both Rahul in conversation on this book. So thank you, Suyash and Rahul, again for joining us today. My is limited. I'm going to step out and sit that side. What I expect in next 10 to 15 minutes, Rahul, give us a picture of the book and what, in some ways, what were the crux of points that Madhva Rao made to Sayaji Gaikwad and context. And if you may touch upon, which is like I've heard and I have no way to verify, that Prime Minister Modi, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he got a hold of these lectures and distributed to bureaucrats in Gujarat them to read. I don't know whether bureaucrats get them or not, but is like this sort of like lectures that were delivered in 1881 has any relevance to modern India? And after that, you both will be in conversation for 25 open up for.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. There's or a discussant, I should say. There's hardly a person with a more intimidating breadth and depth of knowledge, especially in matters like this in the history and theory of politics. And so I'm really grateful to him for taking the time and to others that are joining us online. So the origin of this book, Maharaja, was in an accident. The core of my work for the last decade really has been to try and build this archive called Ideas of India. It grew out of a realization that in 19th century India, even all the way through till the early 20th century, intellectual life in India was not actually conducted through books and not so much through newspapers, which were the two things that most people looked out for. Whether it was historians, there was an idea that if you were trying to trace ideas and even political practice, you would look at those sorts of things, or you would look at government archives, if you material history. And one of the points of realization over the last a decade ago was that there was something quite distinctive about the 19th century that had been missed by scholars and researchers, which is if you look at what was happening in Victorian England, or if you look at what was happening in America in the 19th century, public life was by and large an area in which there were periodicals and journals. That the source, there was as yet no radio, no TV, and books were both expensive to print and circulate, and required a much greater deal of. It was a more speculative investment. Would someone this one book written by someone which is expensive to distribute stock and then sell if you want? So these journals of 19th century, that 600 in English, that gave you and Record called "A Few Days in India." Sounds terrible. Sounds like a dinner for breakfast, but in fact, it was an account of life in the princely states, as they were called at that time. And before that, they used to be called the native states. And before that, they used to be called the feudatory states. Different term, the same thing. This large world that was generally called, over the 19th century, Indian India. The states that were more or less self-governing, semi-autonomous. They only really did not control their foreign and military policy, but everything else in the domestic sphere was more or less left to their government. And like most people, I didn't know a ton about the princely states. I sort of had these generic ideas of them. And when I found this journal, I was startled at the sort of intellectual vigor and vitality about the discussions about about international debates, about foreign policy, about economic and legal policy. And in the first volume, first issue, second essay was an essay called "On the Education of Native Princes." And having been trained in the Anglo-American world and worked for much of my life on ancient Rome and Greece, or medieval Europe, I should say, this immediately rung a bell because it was the kind of idea about educating princes that had been in the Greek world, as they looked at what happened in Persia and places like that. On the education of Cyrus is a famous early example by Xenophon. But then when you move to the Renaissance period on, you have this thing called the mirror of princes literature, which is all about teaching rulers how to govern and manage the delicate balance between political necessity, or doing the difficult things that politics demands, and morality, doing the things that you would want politics to be like. So I, having had that background, read this essay thinking, well, this is interesting. I didn't know anyone was writing stuff like this in India, and was within a page or two was just hooked by the sophistication of the arguments and the careful attempt to reconcile Indian tradition of statecraft that we associate most famously with the Arthashastra, but in fact is actually quite a wide tradition with multiple texts. So it tries to take those ideas from the Arthashastra tradition, tries to take Indian kingship seriously, but then tries to introduce to it new and modern ideas as you find them in Europe, particularly the importance of institutions, the division of labor, specialization, economic competition, and what we broadly think of in the world of economics at that point, balancing private and public interests, the big debate of that century in Victorian England. So I read this essay and I think to myself, well, this is kind of interesting. Who's this chap? And I try and look up, find a Wikipedia page, which is, as most Wikipedia pages are, kind of half wrong, seems odd, grandiose claims that don't quite, that aren't sourced, and so on. So look around, don't really find much, put it away. And then I find another essay by the same guy in a subsequent volume that I find in sitting in Japan, actually, of all places, because these volumes are scattered all around the world. So I find, in volume 6 is an account of what a constitution for the native states ought to look like. And this was quite a revelation, because we think constitutional thinking in India really only appeared in the early part of the 20th century. And this suggested that the first constitution had been put together in modern India, probably by Madhava Rao from the looks of things, as early as 1875, 25, 30 years before we think constitutionalism came to British India. So it suggested Indian India was actually ahead of British India on things like liberal and constitutional ideas. That's quite a revolutionary moment. And so when I found that, I was like, okay, now I really need to find something out about this guy. And so I went searching and then came across this text, the one that you were referring to towards the end of your remarks, which was a sort of pirated version of the lectures and his ideas, including his constitutional ideas, were pirated into this book called Minor Hints, which is he liked that term, and it was a very common term in the 19th century for, like, gentle advice. So minor hints, not heavy hints, and not, minor hints. So, eagerly pick up this book, and it's sort of baffling because the chapters don't really seem connected to one another. They flow in some sort of random order. And I was sort of confused because the essays had been beautifully written, and then this book was all a mishmash, puzzled. And then it kind of made sense why almost no one had heard of it, because it was hard to follow, hard to understand what it was about, even though the content was interesting. And so then I searched around a little bit more. Has anyone written or said or done anything? Do they even know this stuff exists? And it turns out there was only one other substantial attempt in the last 100-odd years to really take this book seriously. And it was a sort of a former retired Chief Justice who had taken this same Minor Hints book and taken sort of extracts from it. And the foreword to that book was written by none other than Narendra Modi, possibly also with the help of an aide or something of that kind. But it seemed clear that he admired the principles that were being articulated in this book, particularly those relating to the management of the bureaucracy. And that was a super striking discovery. He'd written this book had come out when he was chief minister in Gujarat, and he had written this foreword when he was a chief minister. And subsequently, the story later, even after the book came out, I heard from others, I got an even fuller picture. It was actually a bureaucrat in the Ministry of Education that had heard about this book before Modi became chief minister and printed multiple copies of it. And it started to circulate amongst the sort of political and bureaucratic elite. Modi came across it, and if I understand the story correctly, it's all slightly hazy in everyone's mind because it's been now a good 30 years or 25 years. But what he does do is I have heard this from multiple people. He starts giving it to every new bureaucrat that comes to Gujarat from the IAS, saying, you'll find something of use in this. So, I think there's much in the book that does resemble the ways in which he is reputed to conduct himself and especially his dealings with his subordinates, and sort of the emphasis on delegation of some kinds and both loyalty and trust and so on. So all of these sort of fairly important aspects of bureaucratic politics, you see reflected the emphasis on fighting corruption, rewarding people well, and so on, rewarding loyalty. So having seen that there was that level of interest in it at one point, I started searching deeper. And long story short, after many years of searching, found the original manuscript, which then made clear to me, found the original manuscript in Bangalore, hidden in a family archive. And then I realized that the chapters had been scrambled up. When the pirated edition had been published, Sayaji Rao Gaikwad, to whom these lectures had been given, the former Maharaja of Baroda, his aides had basically picked almost at random, but they had a general sense that Sayaji Rao liked the lectures on personal conduct. How should you behave? He didn't like so much the lectures on public administration. We can talk with Suyash about why that was the case, but he liked the ones on personal conduct. And so the aides who had this hurriedly printed in Bombay just shuffled the papers up as they had them, because they didn't maliciously shuffle them, but they took them as they found them, put them together and said, he likes these four, put them on top. And then this set of, I think my estimation is something like about 50 copies were printed. And it said on top, it was for private circulation only. They were never sold. We only became aware of them because of one or two copies leaking out into the public in the 20th century. And then again, for decades, because they were so hard to come by, and this is pre-internet, all of this stuff, no one really got their hands on them, knew what they were about. So that's the background as to how I got to this text and found it. And then in terms of its importance, I'll just say this much, and then let's turn to the Suyash's questions, which I'm eager to hear. When we tend to think why the book, I think, is important, or why his lectures are important, is because they serve as a corrective to two big mistakes that I think even I've only realized in retrospect, having now found this material by him and having built that larger archive. There are two big mistakes, I think, in how we've tended to think about Indian intellectual history, particularly in the modern era. The first is that we have tended to focus on British India rather than Indian India, thinking that everything of relevance, of importance, everything that was significant, every major advance or innovation appeared in British India, and if ever seeped into Indian India. And most of these Indian principalities were in fact backward, stagnant, and showpieces. They were just simply there to leave the British with a fig leaf of local legitimacy. And the rulers in turn were sort of beholden to the British for keeping them in the position they were. The reality is that Indian India comprises a significant portion of the overall subcontinental economy. They were a laboratory for ideas, which is the second point I'm going to turn to. They were actively, you saw people moving, members of the elite in British India would come and serve in Indian India and vice versa. Periodicals, newspapers, speakers moved freely between British India and Indian India. And so we have made a mistake, as I was saying, or there's an incompleteness, I should say. It's not that it's wrong to study British India. Of course, we must. They're by far and away the hegemonic But what we miss is the immensity of the innovativeness and the immensity of the Indian response, which, because it's fragmented and scattered into these different principalities, there's not one force opposing the British, but multiple Rajas with multiple attempts and initiatives. Someone's trying to modernize, someone's trying to push culture, someone's trying to push military relations, someone's trying to push diplomatic relations. If we don't actually focus our attention on these political sites, we miss an immense amount of the story of how India responded to modernity and responded to colonialism. It looks like the story only begins in British India with the emergence of the Congress and the familiar figures in our pantheon. What we don't realize is almost a century's worth of figures before, because the resistance to colonialism and the adaptation to modernity begins in Indian India before British India, simply because Indians can legislate for themselves in these places. So this is a hugely important site, both for scholars of empirical political science. It's worth studying. There've only been 3 or 4 really significant papers on the institutions and economic consequences of British India. But we need to study these. For instance, take a princely state like Bhavnagar. It introduces compulsory education for women by 1886. 1886. British India's not even solved some of the most basic questions of human welfare. Think about land redistribution. We often talk about Kerala or Bengal or these sorts of pivotal moments after 1947. In 1860, shortly after taking over as Diwan of Travancore, Madhava Rao institutes the most important land reform scheme in all of Asia. This is not hyperbole. All crown lands owned by the royal family, which are worth 1.5 crore rupees at that time, so that's 3.5 times Travancore's GDP, are transferred. They were on leasehold from the royal family to individual tenants. They turned into freehold gifts to the tenants. So 3.5x of GDP is transferred to tenant farmers. The only other country that makes that kind of change in the 19th century is Japan in the Meiji Revolution, 7 years later. So we, are missing big pieces in our story, in our own story of national development, if you don't look at the princely states. And the second is, when we move specifically to the world of ideas and not just the site, but what was being thought and done in the site, what Madhava Rao shows us, I have other books that are coming this year, next year, on the princely states. The book that's coming next year, for instance, is called The Birth of Indian Liberalism. And what it turns out that not just Madhava Rao, but really starting from the early 19th century, the very first liberals and the most effective and the most widely read liberals are all in the princely states. And in fact, what we fail to understand is the reason liberalism emerged in the princely states was because it was possible to say, I would like you to do X, Y, and Z, these liberal reforms, to a ruler who's also like you, of your race, background, ethnicity, who understands your objectives. It's possible to undertake this kind of gradualist local reform that the British can't do because they don't want rebellion. They don't want revolution. They're terrified. They want things to stay stable and steady. They're often the opponents of liberalizing reform. But Maharajas and their Diwans can undertake these reforms. But crucially, not only do they have like a site where they can play with these ideas, they are just simply far more confident than people in British India. You can't join the government in British India until the 1880s. You can't move to high positions, even in educational or schooling or scientific or other kinds of institutions, but you can in Indian India. So liberal ideas emerge in Indian India and are actually used by Indian intellectuals to say, we think if you reform Baroda or Travancore or Indore or Mysore enough, it'll actually put pressure on the British to liberalize British India. So our story, if we actually pay attention to princely states, the story starts to turn around. It's not British India bringing liberalism to India. It's not British India educating Indians. There's actually a genuine, authentic, ground up, indigenous, as we would say, sort of liberal account of politics in the Indian context that starts in the princely states and goes outwards to British India. So it turns on our head the understanding of what liberalism's life in India is like. And that's not a small thing, I think. It really challenges both post-colonial and decolonial scholars to think seriously about the domestic roots, as I was saying, the birth of Indian liberalism, that this is not an imposition. It is not subjugation or oppression or exploitation. There are Indians making arguments for liberalism in India and using their own encounters with modernity to fashion a response long before this stuff happens in British India. So that's how I found the book, and that's why I think the book and others around it are important. They fundamentally, I think, change the chronology of our our understanding, as people have to say on Twitter, our chronology samjhiye. So there you go. Thanks.
Not on Twitter, it was someone very important. So,
Suresh, keep your mic closer.
first of all, thank you for doing this book. I mean, the introduction and also the full version of the Minor Hints, because I had also come across an older version, and as you spoke about, there were many problems with it. Let me say a word about how I read this book, and I read very, very closely. I wrote a review also of it. So there are many ways to look at history, and one of them is to try to understand how great people did what they did. What is the path they walked, right? What was the situation they were found themselves in? What choices they made? Why they made those choices? Speculate on those. And so the focus is more on intentionality, character, those questions, than some objective cause and effect, or that understanding. And that way very much appeals to, I mean, the Indian kind of attitude towards history, right? Because we love writing charitas of people, from Krishna Charita to thousands of charitas, the rich literature. And the whole Itihasa literature is very much like that. And that's the spirit in which I enjoyed reading this, because there's a lot, obviously, that is going on around that time. He is obviously making a particular kind of argument to the prince while he's giving these minor hints. There's a political context in which he's doing that. So you have to read it in that context. But he's making many choices along the way. And he's someone who's not just making choices in terms of saying certain things. He's a doer. He's a man of the word. He's in politics and he's in public administration. Most practical of the fields, I guess, next to business. So I thought in this conversation, what we can do is try to understand Madhava Rao. And through Madhava Rao, try to understand the nature of political action. Try to understand how people in politics do what they do, why do they do it. Maybe get a little further on that. But to understand that, maybe we can start with the context a little bit. You touched upon briefly the native states, but if you can dwell a little bit more on the nature of the native states and what was their relationship with the British government, what was the nature of sovereignty that they enjoyed, such as it was, and what was the room for freedom and what are the contingencies for that sovereignty, and then we build on that.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Yash. And thank you also, I should say, for that thoughtful review, which, has really, I read it again and again. I'm working on a biography of Madhava Rao. And so the review and the questions it raised are sort of very much live in my mind. So as to the native states themselves, they form, as British India understands them, after the Third Anglo-Maratha War in 1818. The structure of what we call the native states, which earlier would just have been Indian kingdoms and principalities, now they're called native states because they're in relation to, they all have a diplomatic relationship with British India. They sign a treaty that recognizes the sovereignty and legitimacy of the ruling family, the ruling clan, and hence we start to call them native states. You wouldn't really use that term much before the 19th century. The earliest treaties are signed around 1785. The native states, by the latter part of the 19th century, are about 600 in number, but that's a very misleading number because the 600 include states, as they're called, because they have a treaty relationship with the British. They're actually only a few hundred square kilometers in size. Of the 600, you can say that about 150 are sizable enough that Calcutta has to monitor the viceroy or the larger crown government has to monitor the economies, the polities, and the legal functioning. So there are, in short, administrative reports written by political agents or residents. These are the two representatives of British India, of the viceroy, political agents for smaller territories, residents for larger territories, and they write reports on an annual basis starting in about the 1850s. And that tells you the importance of a place, basically. And that gives us about 150 of these principalities. But even that is misleading because of those 150, most are political agents and most are small and most have very limited administrative capacities because they are the remnants of earlier kingdoms where some sirdar, some lord has basically defected, joined the British, and in return been allowed to keep his little fiefdom. But he or she had previously actually been part of a much larger administrative structure. And so with the disappearing of that administrative structure, the original one, the original principality, they're left with a relatively small set of, retainers and troops, and they don't really have an incredibly well-developed infrastructure, administrative infrastructure. When we talk about truly governing principalities, there's about 30 of them. And of that 30, the most important are places like Baroda, Mysore, Jammu, which comes much later, Indore, the Travancore, and a couple of things that are small, like Darbhanga or Tanjore. They're small, but they have outsized influence because even though they're small, they have inherited very important administrative structures that gives them outsize. Tanjore especially, as you say, in boxing, pound for pound, there's no principality more important than Tanjore. It's tiny, but it basically completely shapes the future of everything in southern India. Almost all the divans, almost all the sort of intellectual elite, cultural elite, at some point trace their lineages back to Tanjore, including Madhava Rao, whose full name is Raja Sir Thanjavur Madhava Rao. And he's just one of a series of divans from Tanjore. So there's about 12 important native states. And when you take that, broadly speaking, that 150, but really fundamentally the 30 that I was talking about, that are the important ones, you have a collection of native states that are about 1/4 of the landmass of British India. They're about between 1/3 and 1/4. It changes when opium appears. Opium causes a huge increase in the value of these economies of the native states because they tend to grow opium and smuggle opium, unlike British India, which tries to constrain the market. And so somewhere between 1/3 and 1/4 of the subcontinental economy is made up by native states. And that figure also changes because states keep getting added. So when Sindh and Punjab and Jammu get added, the size of the native states and their economies grow substantially. So they're about 1/4, between 1/4 and 1/5, as British India changes, between 1/4 and 1/5 of the landmass, about between 1/3 and 1/4 of the economy, and about 1/4 of the population. So these are not small entities when you think of them at that. As I said, the danger is because they're fragmented, we tend to ignore them. We think of one or the other place. But in fact, they're sizable entities. So Baroda, about the ruler of whom, Saji Rao, to whom Madhava Rao gives these lectures, Baroda is about the same size and economic size and physical size as Greece. The population and the economy are about the same as Greece and Europe at that point. Physically, Greece is larger, but economically and in terms of population size, they're about the same. So these are not small or minor entities. And Mysore is even larger, of course, and so is Hyderabad, the largest of them all in geographic terms. So that's for their physical attributes. And then in terms of their sovereignty and self-governance, different states end up striking slightly different balances. But broadly speaking, the two cardinal rules are that their military must be under the supervision of the British. They all have small, attenuated military forces. The British require compulsory demilitarization and reduction in the size of the militaries, usually, sometimes reasonably, but mostly for strategic reasons by saying, this money ought to be better spent on such and such developmental goal, with everyone knowing full well that the British simply want the size of this military to be reduced to a manageable portion, such that the favorite term at this time is they can be overwhelmed by the British in the event of a revolution. And this becomes particularly prominent after 1857, that the militaries are shrunken. They're usually headed by a British officer, but they're natively trooped. So there remains this sort of military cadre. And then there's diplomatic constraints. You cannot interact with other native states and you cannot interact with foreign powers unless you do it through the resident, this representative of the viceroy. And again, the goal is to try and prevent intrigue and to prevent conspiracy. Most of the princely states find ways to work their way around these constraints. And my favorite one is, of course, sannyasis. So I've written a little bit about this, and there's a few works. It's a highly understudied, but it's actually incredibly important to study. Temples, pilgrimages, and sannyasis made it impossible for the British, because you couldn't say you can't go on a pilgrimage. But then when you went on a pilgrimage, this was true for Muslims when it came to the Hajj. This was true for Hindus when it came to Banaras or anything else, any of the major peaks or mats. You could not say you can't do this, and yet there was anxiety because they knew exactly what was happening. These avenues became sources for the transmission of intelligence and information and strategizing. So one of the biggest things that any resident would do was try and keep track of every possible pilgrim that passed through an Indian principality. So there were these constraints on diplomacy and military relationships. But aside from that, as far as domestic governance was concerned, there was an immense amount of freedom. Taxation, the administration of justice, the provision of infrastructure, the support or lack thereof for enterprise and industry, the recruitment and training and execution of administrative functions, the upholding of culture and religion. For example, charity, daan, was a major feature for Indian kingships throughout history, and it continues to be in these princely states. Welfare states that don't exist, or welfareism that doesn't exist in British India, can still survive in Indian India. Well-run Indian principalities like Travancore and Baroda see far fewer famine deaths than British India does, precisely because they have a structure geared up towards providing welfare. They have control over local revenue, so how revenue structures will be organized. Places that Madhava Rao goes to all shift from zamindari to Rotwari systems, tenant systems instead of landlord systems. So there's an immense amount of scope for activity, all of which has an immense, as far from our perspective, they may not be taking part in the high politics of international war and peace, but in terms of human happiness, they have the capacity to have an immense amount of impact on the lives of Indians. So if you think of a quarter of the population, we're talking about something like 60 million Indians have their lives affected by living in places like Travancore, Baroda, Mysore, Hyderabad, Jammu, the Punjab, Rajputana, which I've forgotten in my previous list, but is obviously of immense importance, much less progressive than any of the other places, much less concerned for reasons we can later get into in thinking about human development. But at the end of someone like Madhava Rao's tenure, a decade after he dies, places like Travancore, Mysore, and Baroda far outperform British India on every conceivable human development indicator: availability of schools, availability of healthcare, availability of transport and urban infrastructure, access to markets, the reduction of caste impositions, significantly head in these more progressive princely states. So the impact on the lives and possibilities of individuals is something that one can't underestimate.
So there's a problem of what we call partial freedom, perhaps, in native states, which is that you're free but not quite. So you can go in two temptations. One is that you can seek full freedom, can become a radical, or you can get complacent and say, okay, there's not much we can do, just the status quo.
Yeah.
And Madhava Rao finds third response, it seems.
Yeah.
But it's not a easy response, because his problem analysis seems to be that the British power is institutional. I mean, he says very clearly in the hints that they have their sources of power is moral and intellectual. He doesn't see that our native states are morally, intellectually superior to the British government in India. And on the other hand, he says that the native states are mostly very badly governed. Many of the native princes and kings actually exercise power in a very personalized way and basically use them like milch cows. And that's basically the expression that is often used around that time. But then he goes on to say that I have to work on building the native states, create modern native states. But interestingly, he finds alignment with the British government. There's interest alignment that finds opportunity to get appointed to do this work in native states. So how does that come about? Because he couldn't have been appointed as Diwan without the British government agreeing to it. Not at Travancore, not at Indore, certainly not in Baroda, which was a very precarious position at that time.
Yeah, no, it's a really profound question. It also connects up very nicely with the previous one, which is once we know what the native states are, the question is, what should the British do about them? Why do they allow them to remain in place? Is it purely for show? Is it meant to be for something else? And the British, when they encounter these principalities, most of which they fought to a standstill. And then the question is, as long as these principalities, like the remnants of the Maratha Empire, Indore, Baroda, etc., as long as they are willing to accept British paramountcy, as the term went, they were to be left to themselves because it was not worth fighting to the last on these cases. So initially, there was just a pragmatic, let's not fight anymore. They've submitted, they've surrendered. If we push beyond a point, then we may produce total war. This is the British calculation in the 1810s and 20s. But by the 1830s and 40s, something is fundamentally changing in India, which is as the first class of Indians are starting to be educated in English, as markets and infrastructure and connectivity start to appear, newspapers and periodicals that I was discussing in the beginning start to appear. And now reports about maladministration in one part of India start to spread to others. And so not only do you know that there's shenanigans going on in other parts of India, those shenanigans start to look more abrasive or unacceptable, because here you're reading texts about what good government looks like in the modern era, that there should be institutions, there should be laws, and there should be this economic and social progress, and you're seeing regress or stagnation in these princely states. So it starts to arouse both amongst Anglo-Indians, that's British residents of India, as they were called at the time, Anglo-Indians, but also amongst educated Indians who start to think, this is, so by and large, Indians that are educated in English will do anything not to serve in the native states. They will prefer to be a peon, as the term went, or a junior revenue official in British India, than serve in Indian India, where there is corruption and safarish and favoritism and all of these kinds of things that they don't want to subject themselves to. And so Madhava Rao often makes this point to rulers. He says, why is it that if you want to recruit someone from British India, you have to pay 2 or 3 times the going rate? Because people don't want to come here. And if someone offers them a job in British India at half the rate, they're happy to move. So clear account of what markets tell us about individual choice tells us about outcomes and qualities. So there is maladministration in these states, and the British puzzle for a while about what they should do about this. So the first answer is, well, why don't we just acquire them? Why don't we just, as Dalhousie thinks when he starts annexing these princely states, let's do this. But it turns out that it's both very expensive and very disruptive to annex these states. It's not particularly rewarding if you don't know how to govern them. And there's, as the British fully realized in the 1850s, it's not just 1857, they encounter revolts in places like Mysore or in Hyderabad throughout this era as they try and clamp down on these or tighten their hold on these princely states. So they're becoming, or people are becoming more aware of maladministration, and the British find themselves uneasy about trying to take these states on. And at that very moment, Russia begins to start to head towards India. So now the anxiety is, not only is it going to be really hard to conquer them, if we upset them, if we, to use the French, piss them off, they will ally themselves with the Russians, and we'll have a problem in our backyard. And so this, things like the Hajj become a cause of great anxiety, because their worry is that places like Bhopal, members of the ruling family will get information about what the Russians are doing and possibly ally with them, meet people in the Bukharets and in the Sultanates in Central Asia, where the Russians are expanding, and they could get tempted and seduced. So there's a great deal of anxiety about keeping the princely states as they are. So it's in this conflict between, we don't like what's happening in the princely states, but we can't eliminate them, that the British find themselves in a particular conundrum in the 1840s and 50s. And that's the world into which Madhava Rao falls, sort of, lands right after he finishes high school and college, which is he gets a job in British India, but he can see, having come from Tanjore, his family had previously served in the native states before the British took them over. There's a clear sense of what's possible. And there's a recognition that actually Indians can't do much in British India. The British are terrified. For 25 years, between 1850 to 1875, there's an extended debate. We know it is the debate about whether the ICS exam should be held in India or not. That's actually the reason the ICS exams were being held in England. And before that, why there was an entire debate about whether Indians could even sit those exams, was because there was a concern that if you had successful Indian officials and they rose up the hierarchy, that meant white officers would be taking orders from a brown native, and that was unacceptable on the racial sort of language of the racial imagination of British India at that time. So what do you do with all these young, bright, ambitious people like Madhava Rao who are coming out of these newly formed universities and colleges? And so the British say, we can send them to Indian India. And the Indians say, we can't succeed in British India. We can succeed in Indian India. So there's this meeting of minds or opportunities about, we can't conquer princely states. We also can't ignore them because they're being badly governed. We can't absorb Indians who are talented. Let's put them there. And the Indians say we can't get absorbed into British India and have patriotic reasons, as Madhava Rao does. That's where he's offered beautiful positions. He can join the Viceregal's council, and he's got multiple, magnificent awards offered to him. He doesn't take them because he's patriotic. He thinks that the princely states, as I was saying in my earlier responses to Rahul, that the princely states provide the opportunity for Indian India to actually range ahead of British India. But to return to that one part of your question, British India succeeded because it has the right kinds of institutions that generate a certain kind of moral and economic result. Economically, there are markets that people, as I was saying about the salaries and pay, and there's rule of law and economic institutions that people want to live under those institutions. And those institutions also shape character and behavior. They make it predictable, they make it manageable, they make it rational in all sorts of ways. For example, the absence of astrology in British decision-making versus in Indian princely states, something that drives Madhava Rao crazy dealing with astrologers, right? And so he sees that if he can reform these princely states and actually surpass British India, he will have, as the saying goes, created a model state that then the British have to live up to. So that's this complicated interplay. It's not a neat, clean story. All these actors have their own interests and incentives, and they're each playing a part. No one is the servant of anyone else. And that's the mistake we often make. We think everyone in Indian India, the Maharajas and the Divans, were pawns in a game. But in fact, everyone was playing everyone and trying to, they're all victims of their circumstances and also trying to master their circumstances. So that's the uniqueness of that era.
Also taking risks, like you put these spirited ones in native state, building these institutions. Tomorrow they can become powerful and take you on. But you have to take those risks because you don't have a choice. You need to address the problem of bad governance in some of these areas.
Yeah.
So he finds a way to align in that particular moment, some interest with the paramountcy of the land and his enterprise, which is to work on the native states and get it. But he lands up in the native state, so he spends 15 years or so at Travancore, and then he goes to Indore for a short while, goes to Baroda. But it's also interesting to see how he navigates the local political economy, so to speak. Because his enterprise is to replace personalized rule with more rational and responsible administration, more arbitrary use of power with rule of law, some degree of even constitutionalism, arguably. As you said, he drafts the constitution. Little bit of check on the expenditure of the king, some modern treasury, those kind of practices. All of them, in a way, curtail with local kind of elites in many ways. And he takes on social conservatives also, several occasions. And later, when he becomes an op-ed writer, he continues to do that, against astrology and all of that. So the local political economy is a struggle, because one thing that comes out from the hints again and again is that he's trying to figure out a way to create a rational incentive for them to bind themselves in constitutionalism, some degree of rational administration and all that, give up power by arguing that the British are otherwise going to take over this native state. So my question to you is in two parts. Because the previous answer suggests that that's not a very likely possibility. British don't want to necessarily because they are overstretched already.
Yeah.
So is he? How is he able to make a credible argument to basically to the local elites that this is something that is a high probability event that can happen? And the other thing is that how does he sustain this over a long period of time? Because over time, there are a lot of compromises that he has asked the local elite to make, right? On the control that they had, the ability to act arbitrary. So you've studied this person and you've seen how they decide, and that's where the hints are coming from, right? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there are difficult questions. Yeah, complicated issues involved. So, on the question of
British.
Yeah, of sort of the British are, it's a complicated relationship on both sides. When he succeeds, when on the political economy side, when he succeeds a bit too much, it makes the British anxious. Because you ask me, are there other Indian states really as vulnerable? Because especially after 1858, after the First War of Independence or the mutiny, the Victoria's proclamation says they will not annex any further. And so that makes, you would think that that's the moment at which rulers say, stuff it, I'm not going to do any of the stuff you want, I'm just going to live a good life. So how is it that he's able to still persuade them that they need to make change? And the answer is that, he tries to appeal both to their better and their worse natures. So he appeals to their better natures by saying, look, there is this Rajnama tradition. And you had these great ancestors, and we have this great history, and we're a great people. He invested in cultural enterprises constantly out of his own money, whether it was Marathi poetry or temple building or musical performances or dance. He founded the Hindu Gana Samaj. So all of these, he was deeply involved in thinking that our civilizational inheritance was not something to be underestimated at all. I mean, it was magnificent and worthy of exalting, and it can only be exalted in the Dharma story. If there's a state, can there be Dharma? It's an essential component that there be good laws, for there to be good morality and good outcomes. So he keeps imposing on them again and again these lessons also from look at your ancestors, look at what they accomplished, look at how great the Marathas were. One of the figures that he appoints, who I am also working on and write, there's a book coming further about this figure, is a person called Vinayak Janardhan Kirtane, who's one of the first English-educated Marathi scholars and becomes one of the first educated Marathi playwrights. He writes the first modern Marathi play in 1860. He's hired to become the Naib Devan, works directly under Madhava Rao. And this is not some mistake. It's not an accident. He goes and carefully recruits. This is the person who's going to work with him. The first playwright who's influenced by Shakespeare, the first playwright in modern Maharashtra to write the first modern Marathi thing, which is not based on natak, but is based on prose, goes and specifically hires him and brings him here. And what's the first play that Kirtane writes, the play that I'm now working on, is about the story of the Peshwas. Why did the Marathas lose to the British? So these figures are brought in to appeal to your best sentiments or the best self. And then there's the worst self, which is often, as we know in politics, the more effective one, which is shame. You will be shamed and are being shamed by the British. You may not be conquered, but you will be taken by the nose like cattle and pulled this way and that way. If you are short of money, which is what the problems, why Madhava Rao was as successful as he was, he could fix your economy for you. He could fix your legal system for you. Then you would have inward investment. Then your reserves would be high. And if your reserves were high, you could not actually be at the mercy of the British. So fiscal reserves is the answer to your question. Madhava Rao could say to them, you will be shamed and humiliated if I don't fix your country for you. And it worked. When he left, Travancore, Indore, Baroda had reserves that were upwards of 100 lakhs apiece, which meant even if there were 3 years of famine, they could pay their way through. So he knew what he was doing.
Yeah, so he was able to sustain perhaps because he delivered, right? Because you could see the outcomes of these efforts and they worked. So when he says that the happiness of the people and the longevity of the monarchy are both linked to each other, and he starts showing the results, maybe that's how you buy legitimacy in the local setting. But then he is mostly in all these three contexts, eventually loses the position, right? Because of mostly local issues, and he upsets a few people. But at least in Travancore, it lasts for a long time. Now, one angle to this is the question of social reform. Now, there is a tradition of thinking in India which goes back a long way, has been reborn again and again. 19th and 20th century also there was a book on this, that the role of the state is subservient to the society. Rahul, Pradeep, and co-authors have a paper on this, also interesting paper, is that the role of the state is only to preserve the social order, not to try to change it in any way, not even try to in a limited way regulate it. Still, but Madhava Rao seems to be, I want to know what this view, because from this book I got a few ideas. Of course, he argues for equality before the state. He argues for opportunity for everyone to work with the state, to serve in the state. Absolutely. But further, he also tries to intervene sometimes against discrimination against low caste, and so on. So how would you explain his view? Because one of the reasons why he's sometimes lost, local elite support is because he went after conservatives. But how would you frame his view on the role of the state itself?
Yeah,
it's all social issues, because on the economic issues, we can come to that. There is certainly a full-fledged theory in the way the hints are given. Yeah. But on social, he is very careful to what he speaks about.
Yeah, and this is in part this is also true for the political. It's also true for the social. One of the reasons why he's so readily forgotten, when I was replying earlier to Rahul in these opening remarks, that the minor hints, that pirated copy of his speeches, of his lectures, when when one copy trickles out in the 1910s, in the second decade of the 20th century, and then another copy in the 1930s, the reason that no one really reads them or looks at them is because he's seen as a sellout, political sellout because he's supporting monarchs, social sellout because he's such a careful, delicate reformer, and he doesn't have these sweeping social reform programs or sweeping kind of, and I think this is a great injustice to his circumstances, to understanding the art of the statesman or the art of the leader is to, as we all, this, ever since we've started to think about the idea of prudence, or thousands of years of reflection on this subject, the analogy that's often used is the statesman is like a boatsman trying to cross a river. You can't fight currents, you navigate them. And if you try and fight a current, all that happens is you exhaust yourself and you capsize, right? Either you capsize or you get floated off in the wrong direction. And so the skill, in Greek ethics, the term is often used, metis, the skill of navigating, knowing which current to cut across and which current to float downstream with. And so that was always considered sort of one of the fundamental arts of the statesman and the lawgiver, but particularly the statesman, to actually execute and conduct yourself. And so what he does when it comes to social matters is push for the best possible. As we say, the usual traditional saying, don't make the good the enemy of the best. And so you settle for what you can get. And so, for example, as its time at the time, the pariahs or untouchables, later as we call them, Dalits, but even on lower castes, the social arena, particularly in a place like Travancore, is extremely terrible. I mean, it's just terrible. And the repression and the scale of injustice is incredible. And his response is it's going to be impossible given political and economic alignments to simply sweep it away. But what you can do is steadily chip away at it at multiple angles. And he also watches carefully what the missionaries are doing and learns from them. So you can provide education, which he does, to women and to lower castes. So there are state schools set up throughout Travancore offering education in the vernacular, which are more accessed by lower castes, but also in English, which are accessed by at least some lower castes and those living in more metropolitan areas. There's also legal reform, which he pushes through. The king is very hesitant, again, not because the king, two of the three kings in his time have studied directly under him. He went as their tutor. They recognize the importance of these ideas like equality, but they realize that if they push their luck too far, the principal groups that support them, the Nayars or the Nambudris or the business elite will simply revolt. So and could potentially they could face insurrection and then have to call for the British for help, and it could really get quite ugly. So you chip away. First, slavery is outlawed. Between 1855 and 1857, slavery is outlawed. Of course, it continues in various hidden forms, but then you chip away at those. Then Madhava Rao himself, in particular, pushes the king and succeeds in passing ordinances and then laws that are published, which prohibit, for example, discrimination. You can't say a Dalit person can't walk on public roads, or can't walk past the temple, or can't take part in public events, things that are, quote unquote, that belong to the public. So you start to create a public sphere in which people are equal. You provide scholarships. That's another sort of, or you provide economic opportunities. So one of his very important contributions at all three places was to focus on craftsmanship and traditional arts and crafts, and to try and make them commercially viable enterprises. That meant castes that were associated with these previously seen as fairly limited or even in servile occupations actually are very important professions, and he sees that. So everything from woodworking and fishing through to ivory making and sculpting, he raises the stature of these professions, which then has economic and social consequences following from that. So it's a multi-pronged attack, and of course, every one of these attacks creates enemies, generates enemies. He's taking away the profits that landlords make when he gives lands. He's taking away the social, for example, he also attacks from other angles, which is both in Travancore and in Baroda, Brahmins are exempt from capital punishment. He abolishes that. He says, no, everyone's going to be equal under the law, including the upper castes, or the uppermost of the upper castes. Causes immense anxiety. So here's the part about statesmanship and governance. At some point, no matter how shrewd your governance, when you start chipping away, eventually the brick is going to break. And that is when you meet your match, right? And so in Travancore, he's thrown out because he has upset far too many. Not thrown out. That's the king says, "I can't take any more of you," and he simply will not allow bribery in amongst the king's favorites, and he will not allow the upper castes to have their way and normally allow the missionaries to have their way when they want to kind of engage in more provocative actions. He clamps down on them as well. So the British are unhappy with him because he's saying to the missionaries, you can't undertake conversion, in a sort of obnoxious way. You can't. Missionaries would insist on walking past a temple on terrain that was considered sacred, or building a church right next to a temple. So he would try and negotiate with them or push them, and then the British would say, "You're interfering with religion." And then on the other side, he's saying to Brahmins, "You're not going to be exempt from capital punishment. You're interfering with religion." So the problem of any modernizing, liberalizing social reformer is that when you act through the state, you encounter vested interests. And eventually they will get to you. But what you do is one after another, sequentially, you chip away. You chip away at the base of the prejudice, you chip away at the appearance of the prejudice, and you chip away at the progeny of the prejudice. It's sort of long-term effects. So you change economic structures, you change social practices. So women in Travancore, he educates his own daughters, has them painted, has them photographed, and creates the first girls' school in the fort. Because the objective is, look, if I show you, if I lead by example, then nobody can say I'm being hypocritical. So there's, all these little elements, they all come. So there isn't one doctrine, one program like he has he knows he wants to build infrastructure. So society is not, so with society, careful delicacy is the art. And so that's why he takes that, uses the state where he can, uses personal example where he can't, and uses alliances when necessary.
Rahul, how much time?
15 so 5-10 minutes, your and then.
Okay. So I have many more questions, but I guess we'll have to stop soon. Couple of questions I wanted to just leave with you and respond as you want. One is in your introduction, you've drawn a contrast between him and Machiavelli. Interesting. I found it very interesting, but I wasn't fully convinced for the simple reason that Machiavellianism is about also conditions that you find yourself in. The prince has to get and maintain power, so the impressive acts that you have to do versus the more prudent and more low-key acts that you say that he's recommending to the prince. But ultimately, it's about maintaining power and growing your capabilities, having your own arms and virtue. So in that sense, would you place Madhava Rao in the tradition of the advice to the prince that Machiavelli and Kautilya and many other are in that tradition, that because he's focused on what can be done to augment power in this particular context, where your overwhelming power is, you're opposed to an overwhelming power, which can basically, as 1857 showed, can just destroy your resistance in a very brutal way. So would you really say that philosophically he's some kind of an antithesis to Machiavelli, or can we seem distinct from Machiavelli? Because of course, the distinction you've drawn is about taking power versus exercising power. Yeah. But Machiavelli is as much about exercising power as about taking power. So
yeah, no, it's a very profound question, and I think so. The distinction, I think, is one about, you've already put your finger on it, is context. There's something permanent and something temporary about his context that I think makes this Indian tradition that he represents slightly different from the. I don't like these large terms like Western tradition, but let's just, for reasons of simplicity, let's say, so the kind of reason of state as represented by Machiavelli, and the Indian Shastric tradition as represented by someone like Madhava Rao. The permanent distinction between the two is that, at least to the world Madhava Rao is addressing himself to, these have been stable monarchies with relatively few upheavals, as in, contending clans.
The biggest upheaval is the British.
Yeah, exactly. So, and so, we have, of course, the wars of succession amongst Mughal emperors and so on. These are very bloody, complicated things. But broadly speaking, the existence of a monarchical system is not fundamentally in question for most of it. We have these episodic, what look like semi-democratic or oligopolistic kind of oligarchical kind of arrangements. You find these interesting exceptions in our history, but by and large, the stream is very clear. These are monarchical systems. That's unlike the world Machiavelli has to deal with, where there's first a story of these scrappy Republican and democratic traditions, which are then resurrected in a Renaissance world, and it's a question as to what form is really viable. And that issue of form doesn't arise till the end of Madhava Rao's life, when the British suddenly start to introduce democratic forms. Because at the time he's alive, it's a British form, which is institutional rule by a very strange new thing, ruled by a company or by an organization, an institution, or ruled by families. And he doesn't have to really address himself, and nor do any of the Shastra tradition people have to address themselves to very different forms of government. So since you don't have challenges to your authority structure, the kinds of things that worry you are often much more about stability than they are about popularity. So that's why it's not like Madhava Rao doesn't say you don't need to be popular. There are, of course, these things are still every person engaged in politics has to care about this. But on the margin, I think there's an important distinction there. The contextual difference is that because it goes back, you've already raised this, is because you're confronted with such an awesome power. Let's say there's a distinction between Machiavellianism and Machiavelli's true lesson. Machiavellianism is, oh, if I'm really clever and shrewd and I strike some kind of complicated, deal, I'll be able to outwit other people. You have great faith in your own ingenuity. And that is the tradition that Madhava Rao just thinks is, first of all, it was always dicey. There was hardly any stability in continental Europe, or particularly in peninsular Italy, following those principles. States struggled to survive, and they were quickly absorbed by French and Spanish and German imperial enterprises, hardly survived. And so Madhava Rao is skeptical of one interpretation of Machiavelli. Maybe I should have said it to be more, which is, if you make the distinction between the appearance of Machiavelli and the deeper lesson of Machiavelli, if the deeper lesson of Machiavelli is that, know the lay of the land and match yourself to it.
Not imaginary principality.
Exactly. So here he says what his lesson to princes who, this is what makes him unpopular with Maratha nobles, for instance. They want to, we can fight the British. Yeah. And, we can, we should just resist, be difficult, as we say, Tangarao, all the time, be obstructive. Madhava Rao says, look, it's better to integrate into their networks and enrich yourself. Everyone else around you who doesn't see what you're doing is going to say you're a sellout, as they did to Madhava Rao. But all I'm doing is making sure you have longevity on your side. In 20, 30, 40 years from now, someone will challenge the British, the tables will turn, they will weaken, and you can fight. You can't fight today, but you can fight someday in the future, because no empire lasts forever. And already, as I was saying to you, by the 1850s, 60s, Russia was already on the horizon. Madhava Rao didn't like Russia, but he could also see the French were thinking about returning to Asia. So his view was, look, buy time, build capabilities, and an opportunity will arise. Think like the boatsman, don't think like the zealot. And so it depends on I guess, how we interpret Machiavelli. And on your, I think I'm sympathetic to your interpretation, on a more generous interpretation of Machiavelli, not as a teacher of hot-headedness or a teacher of just violence, but as a teacher of shrewdness, of prudence. Then yes, Madhava Rao belongs to this longer tradition. So,
it's not a question, just a comment, because we're out of time, is that maybe that's why he didn't join the Congress party.
Exactly. He felt that was much of their aims and their objectives are utopian. They failed to understand the social and political circumstances they confronted.
So we open up to questions and comments to Rahul only, not to me.
Something in the chat?
There is a chat.
There's one question on the chat which I've got, so I can, while people here think, let me just run that by. So thank you for focusing on the much neglected part of modern Indian history. I'm curious, what were the influences on thought process of Sir Madhava Rao and other priestly rulers in formulating their ideas on governance and other political matters? This I think you've answered in some ways, but I think what specifically is being asked, the books they had read, the education they had received.
It's a very important question, and it certainly has a very formative impact on them. So the Divans and the Maharajas have very different educations. They overlap in some. When you get a person like Madhava Rao being both tutor and Divan, the Maharajas and the Divans overlap somewhat in their education. But often there's a distinction. The Divans from the 1820s onwards, the new Divans, as I call them in subsequent books, unlike the previous Divans before them, who are primarily only literate in both in math and in vernacular, tend to focus on, they're not widely read. They have mostly studied the Shastras. That's the core of their education. And their goal is revenue maximization and cost minimization. They are not big proponents of investments in public infrastructure because those are expensive and risky and cumbersome and prone to destruction and war. They are in favor of a model of building reserves by burying money under the ground, literally, because it's safer there in raids and so on, building forts, fortifications, and trying to maximize taxation. So squeezing tenants as far as you can to maximize revenue. Starting from the in a few cases, starting from in places like Tanjore, starting from as early as the 1780s. Tanjore is, that's why I'm saying it's the birthplace of modernity in India. We don't recognize this. Then much of my fight is against the idea that British India or indeed Calcutta or places like that were where modernity appeared first. Completely false. Appeared first in Tanjore in the 1780s, where people are starting to read English texts and they're educated by German missionaries, not by the British, and voluntarily, not by compulsion. They start to read texts in modern economics and in modern politics, everything from Adam Smith, to Bentham, to John Stuart Mill, to Herbert Spencer later in the 19th century. And this gives them, they end up fragmenting in the 19th century, these divans, over which aspects appeal to them more. It's a fairly understandable. Some, like some figures that I'm now writing about, this birth of Indian liberalism, are far more influenced by Victorian moralists. Their account, people like Fitzjames Stevens and so on. So their account is that, public morality is incredibly important. And you need a state religion, because it's not because one religion is better than another or anything of that kind. You just need a state religion because it shapes the morality of people and it gives the laws a divine backing that they need. This is a very familiar argument in the 17th and 18th century, but it's really becomes a prominent, big issue in Victorian liberalism. And many Indian divans and Indian liberals in the 19th century are attracted by that mixture of religion and liberal ideals. It explains why you should be liberal, because there's a kind of divine story behind it. But there are others like Madhava Rao who are much more influenced by people like Smith, and David Hume, who think, and Montesquieu. That's the three great figures that Madhava Rao particularly admires, all of whom think about the importance of individual incentives, about markets, and about institutions. So that's one kind. And then there's another kind, a third kind of divan that's really finds a lot of traction. They're educated partly in the vernacular, but also highly educated in the arts. And so they're popular in places like in Rajasthan, or in Rajputana, or in what's left of the talukdars of Awadh, and in Bhopal. These are divans who they will write poetry, they will be patrons of art and culture. Madhava Rao was, but that was one of the things he did. For the others, this becomes, maintaining Kotli paintings. Famously, when we talk about Rajput miniatures and so on, this occurs, and these are all the products of patronage. And they come from a Kotli system that places great emphasis on aesthetics. And that was true for Tanjore in the 18th century, and it becomes true for Rajputana in the 19th century. So you get divans of that sort as well. So really the education of the divans is not consistent. There are different categories and groups where you're drawing your divans from. The Mehtas of Rajputana are very different from the Raos of Travancore, and they're different from the Banerjees who are coming out and working in places like Orissa in the principalities there. So, so there's some variation of that kind. The Maharajas have vastly different educations depending on their the culture of their princely states. In Travancore, in Mysore, in Baroda, in Indore, you are educated in English, because these are states that are really committed, or in the smaller ones in Gondal or Bhavnagar. These are states that are absolutely committed to taking advantage of the modern world. And in others, in Rajputana or in Orissa or in UP, you get now what we call UP in the United Provinces, you get far less of that. You get much more emphasis on maintaining, like in Bhopal, in Hyderabad. There are English tutors, but they struggle to get their wards, the future Maharajas, the princes, to really take on board Western norm, not Western, modern, let's call them. I don't like calling them Western. They belong to all of us. Modern norms, modern ideas, modern institutions, and they're seen as corrupting, making atheists or making Westerners out of their wards, and so they're treated with some suspicion. Less so in these other principalities, less so in a place like Baroda, where the tutor actually goes on to become Diwan, Frederick Elliot. So there's a variety of education for the Maharajas, and the results of the kingdoms show you the differences in a place like Bhopal or Hyderabad never does particularly well, because the rulers are never really comfortable with the changing world around them. Some of again, some of the smaller principalities in Rajputana, Jaipur, Jodhpur, and so on, they've had in the past really successful, dynamic rulers who are quite interested in science and modernity, but through the 19th century, it kind of just plods along.
It is so striking, the similarity of economic ideas that Madhava Rao has and also the wealth of nations.
Yes.
Almost you can map each idea to wealth of nations.
Yeah.
That one, Adam Smith's treatise had such a huge impact, and he actually implements them.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions and then
Yeah, certainly.
okay. There's a mic, so we just want to record, so just hold on a second. And then you can take your.
Mentioned that they one thing is the idea of the level or percolated down to the one they were trying to make in 1935 when they were participating in the round tables.
Yeah.
And whether it had any inspiration that constitution that they draft.
Yeah, no, that's a very nice question. They don't. There's a break between the two for a reason that has a lot to do with why we've forgotten Madhava Rao. When Madhava Rao writes the Constitution, it's heavily inspired by the American Constitution, not in the sense of borrowing, but the idea that there should be a separation of powers, that there need to be these kinds of institutions at the conceptual level. There's this borrowing or this learning from these American models, and he thinks very carefully, because at that point, of course, America is still not fully democratic as we think about it today. It's just finished the Civil War, but still the Constitution is still a restricted constitution, and the institutions are quite powerful as opposed to the populace. So it's worth his borrowing from there. All of this starts to change both in America and in British India after the 1890s, when democratic ideals start to really substantially widen. In America, of course, these democratic ideals have been developing, and the franchise is widespread, and there's greater empowerment as there's economic growth. But in India, there's a decisive shift in the 1890s as the Congress commits itself in 1890, first 1891, then 1895, to what we're going to aim for is full adult franchise, which is a shocking sort of development. No one would have even seen that coming in the 1880s, much less the 1870s when Madhava Rao writes this. So his constitution, which is set up for a king who's going to become, like the British monarch, basically a figurehead, a ceremonial figure, a representative, like we talk about our president today, the kind of figurehead for the nation, a representative of the nation. That's the role he leaves to the Maharajas. And then much of the rest of the regime is something like what we today call a sort of technocratic, meritocratic government, which is supposed to function well and is measured by its performance. The Diwan and his officials will be paid or kicked out based on their performance, which has to be audited annually, and which has to be open to criticism by newspapers and public observers and so on. So it's a very well worked out system of public oversight, British oversight or British critique, domestic technocratic governance, and this figurehead. None of those things make sense after 1890 when we're thinking about a constitution for British India, because it's now clear it's going to be a democracy. So that model, there's going to be no monarchs, and they're going to be instead something like modern electoral institutions, representative bodies, sorry, is what I meant to say, like parliament. And already these representative, legislative councils are starting to see Indians in them. And it's not surprising that we end up with an incremental change on British institutions, because we take British institutions like legislative councils and we fill them with Indian members. Then the story becomes after 1909 is the first, the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, then 1919, the 1930. In that constitutional story, it becomes, well, we're just going to take over these existing institutions and democratize them. So the princely states have no play in that story. And so the end to the princely states from 45 onwards is almost predictable because they can't fit into that model. Because that model that appears after 1909 has no place for monarchies in it. It just couldn't fit. They can't draft it on. And this was what Madhava Rao had always worried about. And that's why he'd said to the princes, hence that thing about Indian liberalism, take the lead now, create constitutional monarchies now, you will last long like the British monarchies lasted. Resist constitutionalizing, and what happened to the French monarchy is what will happen to you. And indeed, that is what happened to them because they resisted.
I have a question on continuity. So, for example, in many parts of the world, the present day states which had monarchs do better on various outcomes than those that didn't, right? Seen this evidence in many parts of the world. So I wonder how this plays out in India vis-a-vis some of these princely states. And the second question is, again, I wonder why, it's true, I mean, I get the political answer now for why there was no continuity, but after his passing away or fading away, what takes over and why is it that, continuously in many parts of Indian history, you kind of see one figure and then you see a break and you just don't see the mechanisms for those ideas and institutions, whatever they may have been, to go forward?
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, so the challenge always this is what that generation in the 19th century realized. And that is why there's this, if we think back to all that our sort of forefathers have done between 1800 and particularly 1950, even the Constituent Assembly debates, there's a realization that one of our greatest weaknesses was the personalization of rule, that it led to bickering within families and between families. And it led to inconsistency in policy and no longevity in planning and policies. And so that meant, I mean, this becomes so obvious when you look at how the company organizes, the East India Company organizes its institutions and its economics. Viceroys do 5-year terms or 4-year terms, and they're replaced by a new viceroy, fresh with energy, ready to do the next thing. And there's you never have a doubt. The company will always be there. But with the king, they age, their sons or daughters are fighting, there's intrigue and battles, and then it's easy to maneuver and manipulate them. And so there was a great realization that from 1780s onwards, and you see the Darbar accounts in Tanjore, there's a realization amongst the elite, the intellectual elite, that this is an institutional weakness, exactly what you're pointing out. A good king comes, or a good ruler or a good divan comes, 30 years of success, and then bang, everything returns back to what it was before. And there's a regression and then a kind of return to mean. So the only change that can come is through institutions. And I'm happy to say, I mean, I think I'm now doing increasingly, I'm trying to build alliances with empirical political scientists to show the long-term effects of these princely states where progressive rule was put in place. We have 2 or 3 significant studies that have already been done, but they're now aging a bit and they don't totally map onto the princely states exactly, but they show that in places like Travancore, Baroda, in Kathiawar, in Mysore, where you had progressive princely rule, the long-term economic effects were such that even after independence, still the 70s and 80s, you get prolonged socioeconomic advantages that even democratic India takes 2 generations to catch up to, on the education of women, on the provision of schooling and healthcare, on access to infrastructure, on infant mortality, life expectancy, even in places in Gujarat, or which start to catch up quite quickly. It takes a good 3 decades to catch up with places like Gondal and Bhavnagar. And that's just a few examples. There's many more. So I keep coming back to them because they're so striking for their investments in public health, sanitation, education. They're small, they're very easy to do a district-to-district comparison from 1900 to 1970. And it's just striking how much further ahead they are. So there are, one of our problems has been that when empirical political scientists do this kind of work, and I say this with great caution, Rahul is within stabbing distance, that they search for generalized explanations. And so they will take categories as given. So princely states are often studied as a given. All princely states are the same. You lump them in one group, British India in one group. That's actually a highly unsatisfactory way to study princely states because they are in fact objectively not the same sets of beings. Just because they have a Maharaja doesn't, it's like saying, you know, everyone that has a head is a basketball player. That's not how it works. I mean, just because you can or have arms and you can shoot a ball, that's not quite the same thing. I think a more viable, defensible metric is something like states that had administration reports where they are clearly attempting to do something. They are engaged in the business of administration as opposed to zamindars who are princely states as well, and small-time talukdars who are princely states as well. They count as princely states, build them into the generalization and you'll wash out your results. Because you've got 400 of these, you know, fairly lackluster, pointless people. And then you've got 30 high-performing states whose results get washed out or at least weakened. So you're not going to find, you know, the kind of probability figures that you want, and you're not going to find the, you know, p results you want. But you're building from the wrong set of variables and cases. And so what I'm urging, and I'm now working on 2 empirical papers with people that actually know how to do this stuff, that first you have to make a conceptual argument that there was in fact no such thing as just a native state. There were progressive and not progressive princely states, and those that are progressive have certain features that clearly objectively demarcate them from others. It's not just I want to cherry pick these cases. There's one type and then there's another type. And then when we look at these progressive princely states, we actually see prolonged effects. That's the that's the empirical result. So one's a conceptual fight, the other's an empirical fight. But I think it'll show that we did make this breakthrough in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that makes the elimination of the princely states, there's a kind of sadness because they worked out institutional structures that were actually well-performing. And we should have found some way to either learn from them or absorb them, or instead we simply dismantled them. And so that's a bit of a tragedy.
So, yeah, this would be the last question.
So I had a question about the nature and extent of, say, absolute power that a monarch had, and that this guy was in the process of discharging or exercising on his behalf. And especially because of the discussion around opposition to reform, being kicked out. So what did being a treaty ally of the British, for example, get you vis-a-vis your local elite or your local interest group? And how did that change or affect the dynamics of what Keshav Rao was trying to do?
Yeah, so it's a complicated question it's difficult to answer. It varies by principality to principality, but by and large, you know, what really mattered for these rulers, why they benefited from these alliances and were often advised by their courtiers to kind of value this alliance with the British, was because it gave them the opportunity to engage in state building, right? The classic story, the classic problem in state building is how do you get rid of your intermediate elite, your intermediate nobles, the ones who are taking a share of the revenue pie, who you rely on for troops. And the standard story is you want to kill the great, found yourself on the people, and take the revenue of the people to build a professional military that's loyal to you or the state with a capital S, and not rely on the voluntary feudal lords. And that's, you know, I'm brutalizing the story, but you get the general picture is this: how do you build a modern state? And alliances with the British, these treaty alliances, give you the space to do that if you were so motivated. It also gave you the space to, as we were saying, just live off the fat of the land and keep the British happy enough by not being too extreme in your, you know, obscurantism or whatever. So in Rajputana, if people were being, you know, executed for witchcraft or whatever, the British resident would say, you know, a bit much. And if someone reports this, I'm in trouble. You're like, okay, don't do that. But you can have, you know, spend your money on cannons and mistresses and, you know, on gambling and fights and whatever else. Just don't do the more egregious stuff. Don't torture and so on. Don't enslave publicly, at least, that kind of thing. So the alliance with the British could allow you to do that. This very unfortunate sort of, and the British were roundly criticized for that all the way through. And especially in the 20th century, it became more and more, as the princes became more and more wary of democracy and therefore more and more dependent on the British, more became the criticism that this was an unhealthy relationship. It was only meant, the alliance only meant that, you know, feudal interests of the, not feudal, but the selfish interests of monarchs were being protected. But there were other monarchs, as I was saying, these progressive states which what they did was focus on using British support to say to their nobles, look, I'm going to give you a new deal. And if you don't like it, and if you revolt, the British will take care of you. So they strategically used the British, the fear of the British, as I was saying to Suyash when he had asked that question. Madhava Rao used the fear of the British against monarchs, and the monarchs used the fear of the British against their nobles, all to try and put through pressure people into making these changes that they saw as necessary, as timely.
I don't know. So thank you so much, Rahul. Thank you so much for such a conversation. What I would request, like for 5-7 minutes, if you can hang on, if people want to talk and just have questions and then
Absolutely.
call it a day.
Thank you so
But
much.
thank you so much. Thank you, Suyash and Rahul both. Thanks.
Thanks very much.